Hello everyone. Today we are going to decode the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe. A world so bitterly cold that even your breath felt like shards of glass slicing the air. Imagine stepping through an enormous wooden gate bound in iron, your boots crunching on frost as a wind howls through arrow slits like the cry of a ghost. The stone walls do not warm you. They steal from you. Every exhale becomes visible proof that the castle itself is trying to freeze you alive. You probably won't survive this, but you'll try anything, because if you don't, the cold wins, and here the cold was as much an enemy as any army with swords and spears. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the time you're watching, because somewhere out there, the snow is falling right now, and someone is still huddling against it. Now let's embark on today's secret history journey together. You shuffle forward, the crunch of your boots echoing against the walls, and you wonder how anyone survived inside these ice-cold castles. It wasn't just the endless winters of northern Europe. It was the fact that stone is merciless. It stores the chill and returns it to you at night when you lie shivering under a rough wool blanket. Medieval nobles may have had velvet cloaks and roaring hearths, but even they woke up to frozen water in the basin beside their beds. Servants often rose in the dark to break the ice before their masters stirred. Historians still debate whether the grandeur of these fortresses was worth the suffering they imposed, because beauty here was built out of discomfort, and prestige was measured in how long you could outlast the frost. The smell of smoke and damp wool clings to you as you move deeper into the castle. Torches sputter, their flames too weak to chase away the biting air. You pass by guards stamping their feet, trying to keep circulation alive, their hands buried deep into mittens lined with fur. They whisper old tricks, layering straw beneath clothing, stuffing moss inside boots, even carrying small heated stones wrapped in cloth near the chest to fool the body into thinking it is safe. Odd as it sounds, these stones became lifelines, and without them, soldiers would lose fingers before battles even began. In these moments, survival was not about bravery or strength, but about the cunning to adapt to an environment that wanted you dead. You might expect luxury to have solved the problem for kings and queens, but the truth was harsher. Royal chambers were drafty, tapestries shook when wind slid through cracks, and frost patterns spread across the inside of windows like silent warnings. Nobles hosted banquets not simply for politics or pride, but because clustering hundreds of bodies together under candlelight was one of the few ways to create warmth. And still, guests sometimes kept their cloaks on while dining, laughing through chattering teeth. Musicians plucked lutes with stiff fingers, while servants ran in and out, red-faced from the kitchen's brief heat, only to be swallowed again by the chill of the great hall. Odd stories emerge from this cold reality. Chroniclers tell of monks in remote monasteries who trained themselves to sleep with minimal coverings, believing the suffering brought them closer to God. Whether that was devotion or desperation, we can't know, but what we do know is that frostbite did not discriminate between the pious and the powerful. Entire winters could pass with frozen rivers trapping food supplies, with wolves circling the outer walls, with peasants shivering in stone huts while their lords huddled in towers. And still, they endured, inventing rituals and remedies that seemed strange, now drinking spiced wine before bed, placing a cat or small dog beneath the blankets as living heaters, or even burning dried dung when wood supplies ran out. As you stand in the castle's courtyard, your breath spirals upward into the night air, and you realize the greatest enemy here was not only the cold, but also time. Every hour felt stretched thin, every night eternal, and the castle became a place of both strength and suffering. Decoding the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe means realizing survival was never guaranteed. It was borrowed, stolen from fire, from wool, from stubbornness itself. And if you could make it through the night, You weren't just alive, you were part of the secret club of those who beat back the frost long enough to see another dawn. You push deeper into the fortress, and the torches sputter against the damp stone, each flame a fragile defense against the suffocating chill that presses from every direction. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only fire, but the discipline of guarding it, because without constant tending the embers died, and with them, the fragile barrier between life and frost. You notice how even the act of breathing becomes a ritual here, mouths wrapped in cloth so the air warmed slightly before entering the lungs, because a sharp inhalation of frozen wind could feel like drowning on dry land. Guards on patrol carried braziers, small bowls of glowing coals, like glowing hearts to shield against the night, and children were sometimes given clay jars filled with embers to keep under the blankets as they slept. Historians still debate whether such jars were safe innovations or reckless gambles, because accidents with smoke and fire left scars on the very stones that promised protection. Light of a torch throws giant shadows across the hall, and you realize that warmth came as much from bodies as from wood. In a castle's winter nights, dozens of people huddled in the same chamber, layering their heat in silence while the stone walls groaned. Soldiers told tales of battles, fought not against men, but against frost, where victory was decided not by swords, but by who kept their fire alive longest. You can imagine the eerie glow of torchlight reflecting off frozen armor, steam rising as soldiers pressed their hands against heated shields just to feel sensation return. There is something both desperate and ingenious about these methods, like humanity clawing at survival with whatever scraps it could claim. Odd details surface as you wander further. Charcoal powder rubbed on faces to retain warmth. Herbs stuffed inside boots because people believed the right smell could trick the cold. And wine mixed with pepper as a false fire for the blood. Some of these customs seem absurd now, yet when you think about the relentless grip of winter, it makes sense. Any ritual was worth a chance at comfort. And it wasn't just the poor improvising. Nobles in their grand halls burned candles not only for light, but also for the faint heat they produced, often placing dozens together in silver candelabras until the wax dripped like rivers across polished tables. The flickering light was a performance, but beneath it lurked a simple truth. Every drop of melted wax meant one less shiver for the night dot as you walk through the chapel. You hear chanting echoing like breath, carried on cold stone. Monks timed their prayers with the rising of the sun, not only for devotion, but also because movement and rhythm kept blood flowing. They knew that sitting too long in the still air of dawn could stiffen limbs into uselessness. Historians still debate whether the acoustics of these chapels were designed purely for sound, or if the builders also sought to create warmth through resonance, the vibrations tricking bodies into feeling alive in places where silence felt colder than the snow. You close your eyes and the hum of the chant feels like a shared heartbeat. One more tool in the fight against a merciless season. The torches hiss as resin burns, the smell of pine heavy in the air, and for a moment you sense how survival was stitched together from fragments firewood dragged in from forests, coal mined with bloodied hands, dried herbs from distant lands carried along trade routes, just so someone in a frozen castle could trick their body into thinking it was safe. Even now, with your boots planted on icy flagstones, you realize the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was a balance of invention, endurance, and sometimes delusion. Every puff of smoke, every shiver beneath furs, every whispered chant in the chapel was an act of defiance. And defiance was the only fire that never went out. You climb a narrow spiral staircase, and the air feels even sharper, each step colder than the last, as though the stone itself has stored centuries of winter waiting for you. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only in fire or prayer, but in what you wore against your skin, because clothing was armor against an invisible enemy. Imagine pulling on coarse woolen hose that scratched at your legs, wrapping yourself in heavy tunics layered one upon another, then fastening a fur-lined cloak at your shoulders until you felt less like a person and more like a bundle of cloth stitched together by desperation. The wealthy flaunted sable, ermine, or fox fur, while peasants patched together scraps of sheepskin, sometimes stiff with old frost, and children wore hand-me-downs so thick they could hardly bend their arms. Historians still debate whether clothing was truly effective at holding warmth in those drafty fortresses, or if the illusion of protection mattered just as much as the fabric itself. Notice something odd as you pass through a dim chamber. Layers upon layers of garments hung on wooden pegs, not only to dry, but to mask the cracks in the walls. In some castles, tapestries became more than decoration. They were insulation, a barrier of woven wool and dye against the bitter wind that forced its way through every opening. Families slept in the same chamber, pressed together in a human knot beneath patched blankets, their body heat pooling like treasure hoarded against the cold. And yet, even in that shared struggle, vanity crept in. Nobles used elaborate furs, not only for warmth, but also as symbols of power, wearing them at feasts as though to say, "I am untouchable, even against the winter that torments you." It was both fashion and survival, one stitched inseparably into the other. Odd stories linger about people hiding secrets within their clothes. Pouches sewn into cloaks might carry coins, charms, or even tiny heated stones wrapped in cloth, pressed close to the chest to create the illusion of warmth. You can almost feel the burn and the relief mingling together, a risky trick because stone could scorch even as it saved. Some accounts even describe spies slipping messages hidden beneath the folds of fur, the cold ironically preserving wax seals or ink that might otherwise have smudged. In this way, the clothing of the time was more than fabric. It was both shield and disguise, and perhaps one of the cleverest answers to the challenge of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe. As you make your way into a drafty hall, your breath frosting in the air, you realize that clothing carried with it an entire hierarchy of survival. The poor often used straw stuffed between layers as makeshift insulation, while travelers returning from the east introduced quilted garments that felt revolutionary against the northern chill. These garments inspired debate among chroniclers, who wrote that some knights began wearing padded undercoats beneath their armor, not only for protection in battle, but also for warmth in the long campaigns that dragged across frozen plains. Historians still argue whether these innovations came from necessity or borrowed brilliance. But to you, the answer seems obvious. Frost has always been the strictest teacher. You run your hands over a tapestry on the wall, and it shivers faintly, as if alive. Behind it, the stones seep cold like veins of ice, but the thick weave dampens it just enough to keep the chamber tolerable. It is here you understand that every piece of clothing, every draped tapestry, every fur collar was part of a strategy, a layered defense against an enemy that could not be fought with sword or shield. And in that defense, you glimpse the stubborn creativity of those who refuse to surrender. The stairwell creeps as you descend again, your cloak heavy on your shoulders, and you think of all the generations who carried these same burdens of fabric and frost. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was never a single solution, but 1,000 small choices. A scarf tied a little tighter, an extra layer of straw, a hidden ember, a tapestry hung against the wind. Each choice meant another night alive, another chance to see spring break through the snow. And in that realization, you understand that clothing was not only survival, it was memory. Every stitch a story of endurance, whispered from one generation to the next. You step into the great hall and your stomach growls, because in this frozen fortress, the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not just about keeping your body warm, but also about keeping it fed. Picture a banquet stretching out beneath smoky rafters, the wooden table heavy with salted pork, barrels of sour ale, loaves of dense black bread that crumble in your hands, and wheels of cheese that taste faintly of mold. A smell of meat roasting on spits fills the air, dripping fat hissing into the fire, and for a moment, you think warmth might be found in flavor. But this feast hides a darker truth. Without preservation, without endless ingenuity, food in these castles would vanish long before spring returned. Salt was not luxury here, it was survival, sealing meats and fish so tightly that entire winters depended on it. Historians still debate whether the amount of salt consumed was a hidden cause of illness among nobles. But what is certain is that without it, no one in these walls would have lasted more than a month. You bite into a strip of dried venison, tough as leather, and imagine the teeth of knights grinding through the same meal, their jaws aching as they chewed. Odd recipes emerge from this struggle: soups made from stale bread, boiled with onions, beer thickened with porridge, even jellies crafted from pig's feet, their gelatin holding together like edible glue. These were not dishes of indulgence, but weapons against starvation. The kitchens themselves smelled of smoke and brine, the very air seasoned with desperation. To stand near the cauldron was to feel momentarily safe, your face flushed from steam, while outside the walls the wind tore at the land like a predator. Yet survival through food was never equal. Nobles could sit at tables stacked with roasted swans and pies filled with spiced fruit, while peasants outside gnawed on whatever roots they could dig from frozen earth. You can almost see the injustice reflected in the icy drafts that sweep through. The hall warmth gathered in one corner, while cold claimed the rest. The castle was a world of contradictions. Abundance and hunger, laughter and shattering teeth, feasts served beside frost-bitten windows. And still, everyone played their part. Servants shuffled with steaming platters, their hands raw from the cold, while minstrels plucked songs to distract from the ache of empty bellies. Waiting at the gates, stranger details survive in chronicles. Some castles kept barrels of pickled fish stacked high in cellars, so damp they dripped with condensation, and children sometimes sneaked down to scrape the salt crusts from the floor to eat them like candy. Travelers wrote of wines spiced so heavily with cinnamon and cloves that each sip felt like fire racing down the throat, a deliberate trick to convince the body it was warmer than it truly was. Historians still debate whether these imported spices were about taste, medicine, or illusion, but you sense that, in the endless dark of winter, illusion mattered more than truth. The hall grows louder as more people gather, the press of bodies itself another form of heat, and you realize meals were never only about food. They were about defiance. To eat together was to declare that hunger had not yet won, that the castle still breathed with life. Every bite chewed in that hall was one less victory for the cold. Yet behind the laughter lingered a fear you cannot shake. What if the stores ran out? What if spring came too late? What if the salt failed? That question haunted every winter feast, whispered in the pauses between toasts. You close your eyes, and the crackle of the fire mingles with the taste of salted meat on your tongue. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was to eat what you could, when you could, no matter how strange, no matter how hard to swallow. Every preserved fish, every stale crust of bread, every spiced wine was not just food. It was a bargain with the season, a promise that you would not starve before the thaw. And as the feast continues, you sense that survival was never about banquets or delicacies, but about endurance, about finding comfort in the salted shadows of the great hall until dawn finally returned. You slip quietly into the chapel, the air colder here than in the feasting hall, yet filled with a strange comfort. Candles flicker before stained glass that glows faintly, even in the gray daylight, casting patterns of blue and red across the stone floor. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only measured in food or fire, but in the rituals that gave people hope when the frost threatened to break their spirits. Imagine kneeling on a frozen slab, breath clouding in front of you as monks chant low hymns, each note vibrating in the chest like a shared heartbeat. The sound itself feels warmer than the air, and for a moment, you believe that song can hold back winter. Historians still debate whether these long chants were simply prayer, or whether their rhythm was deliberately designed to keep monks awake and moving in the bitter dawn hours, when stillness could mean death. You glance up and notice how the very architecture of the chapel seems to fight the cold. High vaulted ceilings carried away the smoke of countless candles, while narrow windows were positioned to let in shafts of light that warmed the stone just enough to matter. It feels odd to think of architecture as survival, yet here every arch and pillar was both faith and practicality. Some believed that God's presence itself offered warmth, but others understood that the builders were clever enough to bend stone into a subtle defense against the season. You feel that duality with every step, half spiritual, half strategic. The rituals of warmth went beyond prayer. People dipped their hands into basins of holy water that often froze solid, so priests sometimes added heated stones beneath them to trick the faithful into believing in divine intervention. You can almost hear the whispers spreading. The water is warm. It is a miracle. Whether miracle or simple trick, it kept morale alive in a place where despair could kill faster than frost. Odd stories tell of relics wrapped in cloth and carried close to the body, not only for faith, but because the layered wrappings acted like insulation, a holy talisman doubling as a heater. Faith and survival tangled together until one could no longer be separated from the other dot as the chanting rises. You see villagers, soldiers, and nobles all kneeling in the same cold chamber, united by breath fogging in the air. It is here you realize that surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was never just about body, it was about mind, about believing you could last through another night. Prayer was warmth for the imagination, and without it, many would have surrendered. Historians still debate whether castles thrived because of stone or because of spirit, but when you listen to the layered voices echoing off the walls, you cannot deny that sound itself became another form of heat. You wander past carved wooden pews polished smooth by countless hands, and notice strange marks on the stone tiny holes in the wall where villagers once placed small clay lamps. The flames were faint, but dozens together made enough glow to transform the chapel into a pocket of light against the winter. Those who knelt here would whisper not only psalms, but also their fears. Wolves beyond the gates, famine in the fields, frost creeping into the nursery. It was in these whispered exchanges that survival was planned. Neighbors promising to share grain or firewood, communities born in the shadows of the cold. The smell of incense lingers, rich and smoky, masking the scent of damp stone. You close your eyes, and the air feels thicker, almost protective, and you realize that the chapel was not just for prayer. It was a place to breathe differently, to remind the lungs they still worked, to remind the heart it still beat. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only wool and salt and embers. It was also belief in warmth, in God, in community, in anything that could make the endless nights feel bearable. And as the final chant fades into silence, you step back into the corridor, knowing that hope itself was a weapon against the cold, as sharp and necessary as any blade. You brush aside a heavy tapestry and feel a rush of stale air, the kind that hints at secrets hidden for centuries. Behind it, a narrow passage snakes into darkness, and you sense that the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe often depended on these concealed spaces, the places where warmth was hoarded like treasure. The walls close in tight, lined with soot that tells you fires once burned here in secret hearths. Some chambers were tucked directly beside kitchens or forges, allowing heat to seep through the stones, while others held strange clay pipes that historians still debate were primitive experiments in channeling warm air. You run your fingers along one such groove, And imagine the ingenuity it took to turn fortress walls into reluctant heaters. Odd details come alive in these hidden rooms. Some castles had benches carved directly into stone walls, warmed by fires burning beneath in vaulted chambers. To sit there was to claim a rare luxury, warmth that lasted longer than a candle. Servants whispered of lords disappearing into such chambers during the harshest nights, while guards rotated shifts to sneak into them and thaw their frozen limbs. The secrecy mattered because not everyone could fit, and the cold pressed relentlessly against those left outside. In this way, warmth became a currency as valuable as gold, traded in silence among those who knew the castle's secret arteries. The passage bends, and you duck low, hearing the faint drip of water somewhere below. Many castles built hidden wells underground, protected from freezing winds, so water remained liquid through winter. Imagine stumbling through these damp corridors with a bucket, each trip a risk of slipping on slick stones, but also a lifeline for the entire household. Historians still debate whether such designs were purely strategic for sieges, or whether they were equally about enduring the natural siege of winter itself. Either way, these hidden structures stand as testimony that survival required not just strength, but design. You pause by a door so small you must crouch to enter. Inside, the air feels warmer, thick with the smell of baked bread and ash. This was a baker's hidden corner, an oven doubling as both survival tool and heating engine. Children sometimes slept on shelves above the ovens, their bodies lulled by the steady heat. It sounds almost whimsical, yet you know the truth was harsher. Only those close to food and fire had such privilege, while others shivered in distant chambers. The castle, for all its majesty, was a place where survival was divided, each stone hiding both kindness and cruelty. Moving deeper, you notice soot stains reaching higher than your head, as though fires once roared furiously in cramped spaces. Some chroniclers described castles filled with the choking smell of smoke in winter, the air so thick it left black stains on tapestries and lungs alike. Oddly, people accepted this trade, because smoke meant heat and heat meant life. In this underground maze, you can almost taste the bitterness, the cough of a child, the rasp of an old servant. Yet despite the discomfort, these hidden fires kept the frost from seizing the walls entirely. Your torch sputters as you retrace your steps, and you imagine how servants memorized every turn of these passages, how they slipped through narrow doorways with hot water jugs or braziers, quietly delivering warmth to favored chambers. To know these routes was to hold power, for whoever controlled the flow of heat controlled survival itself. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not simply brute endurance. It was strategy, using hidden corridors, heated benches, and smoky chambers as invisible weapons against the seasoned dot. As you step back into the main hall, the tapestry falls closed behind you, leaving the passage in darkness again. You realize that for all the grandeur visible to visiting nobles, the true lifeblood of the castle was hidden, a network of warmth and secrecy, woven beneath stone and cloth. To live here was to know these secrets, to share them only with those you trusted, because in a fortress where winter was the deadliest enemy, the knowledge of where heat lingered could mean the difference between life and death. The door to the kitchen bursts open, and a wave of heat slams into you, so sudden it steals your breath. For the first time in this entire frozen labyrinth, your skin tingles not from frost, but from fire. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not written in the towers or chapels, but here, in the beating heart, where smoke, steam, and sweat collided to keep the fortress alive. Imagine cauldrons bubbling like miniature volcanoes, flames leaping from blackened forges, and bakers shoving dough into brick ovens, while sweat rolls down their faces despite the howling winter just outside. Every corner here is alive with motion, the clang of ladles against iron, the hiss of fat dripping into fire, the rhythmic pounding of kneaded bread. This is not only a kitchen, it is a war room against the cold, Your eyes sting from the smoke, curling up to the rafters. But you realize how carefully every ember is controlled. Kitchens doubled as heat engines, warming not just the cooks, but radiating warmth through walls to nearby chambers. Blacksmiths in their forges did the same, their hammer strikes echoing through the castle. Each sparked a defiance of winter's grip. Historians still debate whether castles were designed to channel this heat intentionally, or if it was simply a fortunate byproduct of labor. But to those who worked here, intent mattered little. Survival was all that counted. You lean close to the oven and feel the glow against your hands, almost painful after hours of chill. Odd customs thrive in this heat. Servants pressing damp cloths against oven doors to create bursts of steam, then carrying those cloths to sickbeds where the damp warmth soothed aching lungs. Children sometimes curled beneath tables near the ovens, curled like cats in the lingering heat. And some castles even built sleeping niches directly above bakeries, so warmth would rise into narrow chambers. The ingenuity was astonishing, and you can almost hear the laughter of children who turned survival into a game of hide-and-seek among the ovens. This warmth was not shared equally. The kitchen, filled with food and fire, became a contested space. Servants guarded their places near the flames, while nobles demanded their meals hot and ready, often oblivious to the freezing desperation just beyond. You picture a scullery maid, hands raw from scrubbing pots in icy water, shuffling close to the hearth, only to be shoved aside by a steward declaring the space too crowded. Warmth became another hierarchy, another way castles divided those within their walls. And still, everyone returned, drawn to the heartbeat of survival that pulsed here. The sounds overwhelm you, crackling fires, sizzling pans, the rhythmic chopping of knives. The smell is a blur of roasted meat, baked bread, and smoke, heavy and comforting all at once. You realize that these scents themselves were psychological weapons, convincing the body it was safe, that warmth and food were abundant. Historians still debate whether communal eating by the fire was about efficiency or morale, but you sense that both were true, because every shared bowl meant another night of endurance. Odd details cling to memory. Cooks keeping hot irons ready, not only for food, but also to press into frozen boots. The sizzling hiss startling enough to remind everyone of the cold's relentless reach. Blacksmiths warmed their tools before battle, knowing that frozen iron shattered more easily. Even bakers had their rituals, whispering blessings over bread loaves, not only for taste, but because the very act of blessing seemed to wrap the food in imagined warmth. You stand in the center of this chaos and feel the castle breathing. Every shout, every clang, every puff of steam is a reminder that without kitchens, forges, and bakeries, these stone walls would be tombs. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was to transform labor itself into fire, to make work the source of heat, to let sweat and smoke become the lifelines of the fortress. And as you step back toward the drafty hall, a sudden drop in temperature shocks you, but you carry the memory of that living furnace with you, the heartbeat of survival, echoing long after the door closes. The courtyard yawns open before you, a sheet of ice glistening under a pale moon, and the first step you take nearly sends you sprawling. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was never only about warmth inside, it was also about enduring the dangers outside, where the cold itself became a weapon. You hear the crunch of frost beneath your boots, sharper than glass, and you can almost see the ghosts of those who slipped here centuries ago. Servants carrying buckets of water that froze before they reached the kitchen, guards staggering in armor too brittle with ice to move quickly. The courtyard is beautiful in its silver glow, but beauty here is laced with cruelty. You imagine prisoners locked in cells at the edge of the yard, their breath frosting against iron bars, their chains stiff with ice. Chroniclers tell of men whose beards froze to their chests, of women who huddled together in corners, only to be found at dawn stiff as the walls themselves. Historians still debate whether such deaths were deliberate acts of punishment or simply the unavoidable fate of living stone fortresses in unforgiving climates. Either way, the message was clear. In these castles, the cold was as much judge and executioner as any human lord. Odd tales emerge from these frozen courtyards. Some lords allegedly ordered buckets of water dumped across stones at night, turning the ground into slick ice so enemies storming the gates would fall helplessly before archers. It was survival by transformation, turning weather into defense. You picture attackers slipping, arrows raining down, their armor clattering like bells across the frozen floor. In these moments, the frost itself was a soldier, loyal only to the castle, but the courtyard also held life. Children bundled in wool sometimes skated across its frozen puddles, their laughter ringing against the high towers. Servants rushed through snow carrying firewood, their feet numb, but their faces set with determination. Nobles strolled in cloaks trimmed with fur, trying to show that they were untouched by the cold, though their shivering hands betrayed them. To stand here was to feel the contradictions of the fortress, joy and cruelty, defense and danger, life and death, all breathing in the same icy air. Your eyes catch the glint of frost on a rack of weapons left near the wall. Spears stiff with ice, swords that feel heavier because of the frozen air. They remind you that battle in these conditions was a gamble. Soldiers sometimes fought with fingers so numb they could barely grip their hilts. Some even died not from wounds, but from frostbite, spreading faster than help could arrive. Yet still they trained here, swinging swords at dawn, their shouts clouding in the air like smoke, their resilience as sharp as the blades they carried. You press your hand against the stone, well in the center of the yard, its rim slick with ice, and imagine the countless hands that once did the same. Water drawn here would freeze before reaching the lips of the thirsty, so guards often broke the ice with daggers before lowering buckets. Some castles even poured heated oil on the rims to keep them workable in midwinter. A desperate but clever trick. Historians still debate whether these measures were common practice or rare ingenuity, but you realize that every drop of water was a battle won against frost. As the wind cuts through the yard and rattles the flags above, you understand that the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only found in the hidden fires and kitchens, but also in mastering the very courtyard that seemed determined to kill. To walk here was to accept risk, to slip and rise again, to endure the sting of wind that peeled at skin like knives. And if you survived it, you carried with you a strange pride, the kind only earned by standing tall against an enemy no army could defeat. The hallways grow darker as you follow the sound of voices, and soon you find yourself standing before a great hearth where flames leap and crackle, painting the stone walls with shifting shadows. Around the fire, people gather close, their faces lit with orange glow, and you sense immediately that the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only in what you ate or wore, but also in the stories you carried. For when the cold pressed too hard, when frost crept into your very bones, imagination became another form of heat. The fire snaps loudly, and a hush falls as an old man leans forward, his eyes gleaming as he begins to speak of dragons coiled in mountain caves, of witches who stirred storms with a whisper, of heroes who rode through snow, carrying swords that burned like sunlight. Children clutch at their mother's arms, not from fear of the cold, but from the thrill of these tales. The oddest detail strikes you. In some chronicles, storytellers are described as more valuable than soldiers during winter. A knight might keep a castle safe from invaders, but a storyteller kept its people alive against despair. Historians still debate whether such accounts exaggerated their importance, but you can imagine the truth of it, because here in this frozen fortress, the difference between endurance and surrender is often a flicker of hope. You picture servants leaning in, their hands wrapped around mugs of warm ale, listening as voices weave legends across centuries. These stories traveled from distant lands, myths of Africa, where suns blazed eternal, epics from Asia, where emperors banished frost with dragons of fire, sagas from the Norse that spoke of Ragnarok and endless winters. Each tale was a spark, reminding listeners that they were not alone, that others had faced cold and survived. In a strange way, the hearth became not only a place of heat, but a library of resilience. Odd customs surrounded these nights. Some castles kept a carved storyteller's chair, draped with furs, where only the chosen voice of the evening could sit. Children sometimes placed small charms in the fire, believing the smoke carried their wishes into the tale itself. You could almost smell the resin of burning pine, thick and sweet, mixing with the sound of laughter as the fire's warmth blended with the warmth of words. The stories did not always soothe. Sometimes they warned. Legends of traitors frozen by divine punishment, of ghosts wandering battlements, of witches whispering in icy winds, all served as caution. A reminder that winter revealed not only nature's cruelty, but also human weakness. These tales had teeth, gnawing at listeners' fears. But paradoxically, they kept people sharper, more alert, less likely to surrender to the lull of sleep that could mean death. Historians still debate whether these dark legends reflected real punishments or simply moral lessons. But in the firelight, they were as real as the frost creeping outside the door. You notice how the entire hall seems warmer when the story peaks, as though the crowd's excitement itself feeds the flames. It's not simply metaphor. Science tells us adrenaline heats the blood, and perhaps those long-ago listeners felt the same, trembling not only from chill, but from the pulse of narrative. Around the hearth, fear became excitement, despair became laughter, and the night seems shorter than it truly was. As the tale ends, applause ripples like sparks, and for a brief moment, the castle feels alive in defiance of the storm outside. The secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was not only in fire and food, but in words, in weaving legends that distracted, comforted, and emboldened. You step away from the fire with the smell of smoke in your hair, carrying the echo of stories that outlasted even the harshest winters. They remind you that survival is never just physical. It is also memory, imagination, and the power to believe that dawn will come. Dawn creeps slowly across the battlements, and for the first time, the air feels less sharp, as though winter itself is loosening its grip. You watch rivulets of water drip from the stone, tracing paths through the frost, and you realize that the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe always led here to the moment of thaw. The courtyard that once rang with the crack of frozen boots now gleams with puddles, and the harsh silence of winter is replaced with the faint trickle of meltwater echoing through the wells. The sight is almost shocking. You had grown so used to the bite of cold that warmth feels like a stranger arriving at your door. Historians still debate whether spring in these castles felt like rebirth or exhaustion, whether relief was tempered by the scars of frostbite, famine, and loss. You sense it must have been both. For peasants, the thaw meant soil softened enough to plow, but also the desperate labor of catching up on months of lost growth. For nobles, it meant the resumption of travel, feasts, and diplomacy. Yet beneath the velvet cloaks lingered memories of nights spent shivering beside dwindling fires. You can almost hear the sighs of entire households as the snow receded, a collective exhale after months of holding breath. Odd details surface even in this rebirth. Chroniclers wrote of ice stored in deep pits, deliberately saved for summer to cool wine, a strange inversion of suffering turned into luxury. Others describe lords holding festivals where blocks of ice were shattered in celebration, each crack like a symbolic breaking of winter's chains. Some even believed that melting snow carried blessings, and so villagers filled jars to sprinkle on fields or baptize children. Whether superstition or ritual, these acts reveal a truth. Survival was not just about enduring winter, but about transforming its memory into power. You walk through the corridors now damp with thaw. The once deadly drafts softened into gentle breezes. Tapestries flutter lightly, no longer shields against gales, but mere decoration once more. Kitchens buzz with new energy, preparing fresh meals not out of desperation, but anticipation. The blacksmith's hammer rings brighter, echoing not only labor, but optimism. It is in these rhythms you feel the castle's pulse returning, as though the fortress itself had been sleeping and now stirs awake. Yet even in the light of spring, the lessons of the ice-cold castles remain. Every ember, every salted cut of meat, every whispered prayer and fireside story carried people to this moment. Without them, the thaw would never be seen. Historians still debate whether castles stood more as symbols of military power or as monuments of human resilience. But to you the answer is clear. Their true strength was revealed not in battle, but in the endurance of winter. The final snow melts on the parapet, dripping onto your hand like a cold farewell. You understand that the secret of surviving the ice-cold castles of medieval Europe was never one single act, but a chain of choices: stone, wool, salt, faith, fire, and story all woven together to defy nature itself. And as the sun finally warms your face, you know those who lived here were not only survivors, but storytellers, leaving behind a legacy carved into both stone and memory. Now, as our journey comes to its end, take a deep breath and let the images soften. Picture the snow fading into fields of green, the smoke of hearths thinning into blue sky, the echoes of chants dissolving into birdsong. The castle stands no longer an icebound prison, but a monument to resilience, and you carry with you its hidden lessons. The cold no longer bites. It drifts away like a fading dream. May you step back into your own world with warmth in your chest and calm in your mind. End of script. Wishing you much joy and health.